This was the largest bomber that we used in World War II. It was used exclusively in the Pacific against Japan because we needed long-range bomber. This is the actual bomber that dropped the second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. Again, at the beginning of World War II, China was at war, but America was neutral, so there were American volunteers who were flying for the Chinese. And that was where the American Volunteer Group or Flying Tigers. The Chinese government had contracted with a retired American fighter pilot named Claire Chenault to set up some kind of defensive capability to protect them from the Japanese who were bombing them. And he set up the Flying Tigers. They were flying, again, the P-40s. The P-40s were provided by the American government on a secret, very top secret, under the table type of arrangement. They were shipped as agricultural equipment. So the shipping manifest said they were agricultural equipment. But the American government provided them. At that time, we were still neutral, so we couldn't admit that we were providing weapons to the Chinese. They provided about almost 100 P-40s. The P-40, as I said, was an improved version of the P-36 I showed you earlier. Basically, the engine has been replaced. It went from the radial engine to a more powerful liquid-cooled V12 engine here, an Allison engine. It has the guns have been moved to the wing, so now it has 3 guns in each wing. It also added armor plate behind the pilot to protect the pilot from an enemy fighter behind him. So armor plate will protect him from that. It has an armor plate. It also has what's called resealable fuel tanks. So a resealable fuel tank is a rubber bladder that lines the fuel tank, so if the bullet penetrates, the fuel will hit that rubber, the rubber will expand and close the hole, so it reseals the hole. So it allows them to withstand more battle damage, so it allows them to be more rugged airplane. A little bit heavier, but it does allow them to withstand bullet holes. So that was what the P-40 was flying. Now the P-40, the Flying Tigers were flying against the Japanese Zero. This is the Zero. The Zero was designed for long distance. The Japanese wanted something that could fly over 1,000 miles, so they wanted a very lightweight aircraft. It is designed specifically for very lightweight. It doesn't have any armor plating. It doesn't have resealable fuel tanks, but because it's very lightweight, it's very maneuverable. It could out-climb, out-turn, out-maneuver anything that we had at the time. That's why it was so effective at the beginning of the war, because it was so maneuverable. In a turning dogfight, the Zero would win over a P-40 every time. So what Claire Chenault did was he took advantage of the P-40 strength. The P-40 being a heavy, rugged airplane, it could outdive the Zero. It could dive much faster than the Zero. The Zero couldn't keep up with it. So what they did was they had Chinese observers on the ground. They would see where the Japanese formations were coming. They would tell the Flying Tigers where they were. Flying Tigers would fly to a higher altitude, wait for the Japanese formation, and then dive through, shoot up as many airplanes as they could as they were diving through, and then fly away. The escorting Zeros couldn't catch them. So they would just fly away, climb to altitude, wait for the formation again, and dive through again. By doing that, they took advantage of their superior dive speed and did not try to engage the Japanese in a turning dogfight, which they'd lose. And they had a very, very high successful kill ratio. They were able to destroy many more Japanese airplanes than they lost.
Did the Army Air Force ever practice the touch reef like the Navy did?
I'm sorry?
Did the Army Air Force, like the AVG, did they ever practice touch reef like the Navy?
No, the touch reef was typically a Navy. I think eventually they probably learned it from the Navy, but that was kind of something the Navy developed at the time that the Army was doing this.
And would you consider the Zero to be better or equal to the Japanese Ki-43, which was also encountered over Burma? The Japanese most like common army fighter was the Ki-43, Nakajima.
Yeah, I'm not real sure.
Okay.
I can't really. I just know. I know the Zero. We have a Zero, so I think really good about that. It was very maneuverable. I think they were probably comparable. This was probably maybe a longer range.
Yeah.
So probably a little bit lighter. Might be a little bit more maneuverable, but. Okay, so we get to early 1942. Japanese are sweeping across the Pacific, pretty much defeating the Americans every place we meet them. So we needed a morale boost. So a Navy submarine commander came up with a crazy idea of attacking the Japanese homeland with Army medium bombers launched from an aircraft carrier. It seemed like a crazy idea, so they went to Jimmy Doolittle. This mannequin represents Jimmy Doolittle. He was a fighter pilot, race pilot, test pilot from World War I to World War II. He was relatively famous as a test pilot and a racing pilot. He was also one of the first Americans with a PhD in aeronautical engineering. So he knew airplanes from a theoretical standpoint, from a flying standpoint. So that's why the Army went to him and said, what airplane should we use? Can we do this? He chose the B29 Mitchell bomber, nicknamed the Mitchell bomber after Billy Mitchell, the general I mentioned earlier. He chose this airplane because the wingspan is short enough it could take off from an aircraft carrier, but it still had enough takeoff performance it could take off in 500 feet, which was the length that they needed. So they got 16 aircraft and crew, took them to Florida, started training them to take off in 500 feet. Didn't tell them why they had to take off in such a short distance, just they had to take off in 500 feet. It wasn't until they got to the Pacific coast and saw their airplanes being loaded onto an aircraft carrier that they realized why they had to take off in such a short distance, but they still didn't know where they were going or what they were doing. They weren't told what the mission was going to be until the task force was at sea and there wasn't any possibility somebody would go to a bar afterwards and spill the beans. So they were told where they were going. They were told it was a very high-risk mission, so it was a volunteer mission. Anybody who didn't want to participate could back out, didn't have to fly. Nobody backed out. They all said, yeah, let's go. Let's hit Japan. The plan was to get within 400 miles of the Japanese coast, launch, attack at night, drop bombs on factories in some of the industrial cities, Kobe, Tokyo, some of the other industrial cities, continue on, fly to China, the safe part of China that had not yet been occupied by Japan, land, they could then refuel from there, and they could continue bombing the Japanese in China area. So they could continue to stay in the war there once they got to China. That was the plan. But the task force was spotted 600 miles off the coast by a Japanese patrol boat. They sunk the patrol boat, didn't know whether they got a message out or not, so they had to decide whether to launch or not. They decided to launch anyway, so they took off 600 miles out early. They ended up attacking during the day. Fortunately, the Japanese did not expect any possibility of anybody being able to bomb them at that time, so they had very minimal defensive capability, very minimal ground guns, very minimal fighters. So they basically just flew in, dropped their bombs with very minimal defensive opposition, and continued on into China. But they did not have enough range to reach the safe part of China. They had to fly until they ran out of fuel, and then just either jumped out of the airplane or crash landed. So they all basically came down in the Japanese occupied portion of China. Fortunately for them, the Chinese civilians escorted, medics helped them guide them out of that portion to the safe part of China, so they could then get rejoined to Americans and then get back to the United States. Jimmy Doolittle later commanded the bomber forces in Europe, so he got back in the war. But so that they were able to get back into safely escorted out. In retaliation for that, they say the Japanese killed about 250,000 Chinese civilians in retaliation for them helping the Americans escape. Now, from a practical standpoint, they didn't do a lot of damage. They just didn't have enough bombs to do a lot of damage. But they had a tremendous morale boost for the Americans because we were able to finally hit back at the Japanese successfully. And it was a tremendous loss of face for the Japanese generals because they, of course, had told the emperor there's no way that anybody could possibly attack the homeland, and yet these bombers would come in and bomb. They had no idea where they came from, so they had to bring fighter units from front lines back to Japan to defend the homeland from wherever these bombers were coming from. So it did have a morale boost from that standpoint. Okay, now I mentioned earlier the AT aircraft that were used for training the bomber and cargo pilots. So these are a couple of the twin-engine AT aircraft used for training those. The aircraft you see up there on the pedestal, that was used for training bombardiers. So in World War II, we had what was called the Norden bomb site. It was a very accurate medium to high altitude bomb site that was used for, they claimed that they could hit a pickle barrel from 17,000 feet. That was a gross exaggeration, but it was a fairly accurate bomb site, so they would train them in aircraft like that. Now, over here we have what's called our WASP display, Women's Air Force Service Pilots. At the beginning of the war, we needed lots of pilots. Of course, we needed pilots for combat, but we also needed pilots to do things like test the aircraft when they came out off the production line, make sure they flew the way they were supposed to, then fly those airplanes from the factories to operational units. We needed pilots to tow targets on cables so other pilots could practice aerial gunnery. We needed instructor pilots. So we need lots of pilots that weren't doing combat missions. So a group of women pilots suggested that women could do those missions, and they formed the Women's Air Force Service Pilots. There were over 1,000 women who flew those missions, completed the training, and flew those missions through the war. Basically Army missions, but non-combat, ferrying the aircraft to overseas units, etc. They continued that until December of 1944. At that time, the war in Europe was winding down. We had bomber crews returning from Europe who had finished their service there. And the Army said, well, we can use these guys to fly these missions. We don't need the women anymore. They said, thank you, ladies, very much. Go back to your kitchens. That's it. And they didn't give them any veterans benefits or anything. It wasn't until 1977 that Congress finally passed an act that recognized those women as veterans and finally gave them veterans benefits. So it was 30 years later they were finally recognized for their service. Okay, now this is our display for the Tuskegee Airmen. Again, during World War II we had segregation. In the military, we had segregation all over. In the military in particular, you had either all black units or all white units. You could not mix races in the same unit. When the Army was looking to train lots of pilots, they did not want to waste time and take the American consideration training black pilots. They didn't think blacks could do it, so they didn't want to train blacks. But Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, and other civil rights activists insisted that they train blacks as well, so they set up a program at Tuskegee University in Alabama to train black pilots for the military. When they formed fighter squadrons, went overseas, went to basically Europe as fighter squadrons. Most of them painted their tails red, like this model we have up there, and so they were called the Red Tails. That was to identify the unit. They were called the Red Tails. They developed a very, very good reputation, both for escorting the bombers into enemy territory and also providing air support for ground troops, basically providing air support for other enemy fighters and doing ground attack type missions. So they proved themselves just as good as anybody else, and that they could do the job just as well as anyone. So after the war, we eventually had desegregation. A lot of that was due to the example of the Red Tails. Now, most people hear about the Red Tail fighters. There were some Tuskegee Airmen who were trained as bomber crew, but the bomber units never got to Europe, so you don't hear much about them. Mostly you only hear about the Red Tail fighter pilots. Okay, I'm running late. Okay. All right, so I mentioned strategic bombing earlier. In World War II, strategic bombing was very critical from the beginning of the war. Both the British and the Germans were bombing each other. Mostly they bombed at night. The advantage of bombing at night is you don't have to worry about enemy fighters shooting down your bombers, but you can't really see your target. You can find the city, you know about where the target is, you drop your bombs where you think that is, but whether or not you're actually hitting the target, you're not really sure. When America got involved, we had our Norden bomb sight, which we claimed was so accurate, as long as we could see the target. So we insisted on precision daylight bombing. We would attack during the day, we could see the target with a Norden bomb sight, we could hit it. That was the plan. The problem is then you were facing enemy fighters. At the beginning of the war, our American fighters did not have the range to escort the bombers very far into enemy territory. They could only escort them a certain distance, and from that point on, the fighters had to leave and the bombers had to defend themselves. That's why the heavy bombers in World War II are very heavily armed. If you look at the two main heavy bombers we have, the B29 here and the B-17 up there, you notice they both have about 10 machine guns on them. They have top turrets, bottom turrets, tail turrets, side turrets, guns in the front, guns in the back, guns all over the place. Over half of the crew were dedicated just to manning the guns to defend the bombers. So the aircraft would fly very tight formations next to each other, above and below each other, so that any attacking fighters would face guns from a large number of bombers. So they would try to defend themselves, but they were still having heavy losses. Also, once they got close to the targets, then they faced flak cannon. So the cannon, the artillery piece you see over there, that's an 88 millimeter German artillery piece. That would fire a shell up to the altitude of the bomber formations. The Germans would use radar to determine what the altitude was. They fire the shells to detonate at that altitude. The shrapnel would go out. Shrapnel would kill aircrew, damage airplanes, shoot down airplanes. You have large number of batteries around the factories defending them, so they would face very heavy flak artillery fire when they got close to targets. So they were suffering very heavy losses. If you look at the losses of the Marines in the Pacific and all the island hopping that they did throughout the Pacific, there were actually more air crew killed in Europe, bomber crews killed in Europe, than all of the Marines killed in Europe in the Pacific because of the heavy losses. Because of that, the morale was low, and the Army set up a program. Basically, they would give the aircrew a goal. If they could survive 25 missions, they would be sent back home. If they could survive 25 missions, they would be sent back to the United States, and they would then train other crew members in the United States, but they'd be safe from combat. The Memphis Belle here, down pedestal, that is the first B-17 in Europe to complete 25 missions and then be sent home. So after its 25th mission, the Memphis Belle was sent back to the United States. It flew around the United States on a war bomb tour, basically trying to get people to buy war bombs, and that's why it's the most famous and iconic aircraft from World War II. This is the actual Memphis Belle. After the war, it was put on display in Memphis, Tennessee for many years, but it was outside and exposed to the weather. It was finally deteriorated quite a bit. It was brought back to the museum here. It spent about 13 years in our restoration hangar and was finally restored back to its original condition. And then it was put up on the pedestal here and was unveiled to the public on the 75th anniversary of its 25th mission. It's a beautiful restoration job. It is painted in exactly the scheme that the aircraft was on its last mission. Painted as it was on its last mission. So if you notice, where it has the row of bombs there on the nose, and then you notice the photo over here, that on that photo it has a row of swastikas under the bombs. That was the way it was painted for the war bomb. But in the combat, it had the row of bombs, but then you notice it has one swastika under the gun, right behind the Memphis Belle there. There's one swastika there. That's because that gun position shot down one German fighter. And so whatever gun position shot down a German fighter, the swastika would be pointed at that gun position where it was. So there's swastikas all over it, but for the war bomb tour, they decided to put them all in one row on the front so everybody would know how many airplanes were shot down by this airplane. Okay. I mentioned earlier the Spitfire. This is our Supermarine, one of our Supermarine Spitfires, British, one of the top British fighters. Next airplane I want to show you is the Messerschmitt Bf-109. So the Messerschmitt Bf-109 was the most numerously built of the German fighters. It was their top fighter at the beginning of the war. It continued in service throughout the war. As I said, it was the most numerously built of the German fighters. This was probably their main fighter. It was very fast, very maneuverable. It had two machine guns that fired through the propeller. So there's two machine guns that be mounted on the top of the engine that fire through the propeller. And then, if you notice here in the center of the hub, that is for a 30 millimeter cannon. So it would have a 30 millimeter cannon firing right through the center of the propeller. It would have a 30 millimeter cannon and then two machine guns on the top. So very effective firepower. Very effective fighter. Now I've talked a lot about combat airplanes. Let's talk about some cargo airplanes. This is a C-47 cargo airplane. This is the type that was used for flying supplies to the troops. Also used for carrying paratroopers. Tomorrow's the 80th anniversary of the D-Day invasion. Actually, 80 years ago tonight, the paratroopers launched. So they launched on June 5th, flew behind into France and landed in France the night before the invasion. And they were flying mostly in C-47s or cargo planes like this. They would basically parachute out with a gun, a couple days ammunition, and that was about all they had. The next day, they had to establish a landing zone in France that they could bring in the cargo gliders. So this glider up here is a cargo glider. This would be towed behind a C-47 on a long cable. Once it got close to the landing zone, it would disengage from the cable, glide to a landing, The front of that would flip up. They could drive a Jeep out of that. They could carry a howitzer like this gun here. They could carry mortars, machine guns, ammunition, food, and more troops. Everything they needed to reinforce the lightly armed paratroopers who landed the night before. So that's how they had to support them. Okay, now this is a P-51 Mustang, one of the most famous American fighters in World War II. It was originally built by North American for the British during the Battle of Britain. North American was trying to provide the British with more airplanes. It was originally built with a V12 liquid-cooled Allison engine. When they got to England, the British found it didn't have very good high-altitude performance. So they decided to see what would happen if they put a V12 Merlin engine, one of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engines in it, also liquid-cooled V12 engine. They put that Merlin engine in it. It had fantastic performance. So from that point on, they kept using a Merlin engine. This engine is a Merlin. It's a Rolls-Royce Merlin design engine, but it's built by Packard. So built under license by the Packard company here in the United States, but is the Merlin design built under license. So we started basically building those Merlin engines, and that was what powered the P-51 from that point on. So with that, these aircraft had the range to escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. So they had long range escorts. They were able to provide the escort we needed. Now you notice the drop tanks there? Those were used to ferry the airplane, to fly the airplane deep into enemy territory. And then once they got in combat, they drop those fuel tanks and fly back on the internal tanks, as wing tanks and fuselage tanks. But they found that the Germans were picking up the drop tanks and reusing the aluminum. So these drop tanks are made out of paper mache. They would make them out of paper mache. They had a special lacquer lining that would last a few hours before the gasoline would deteriorate. It would last long enough that they could use up the fuel and then drop it. Okay, now I mentioned cruise missiles before. The Kettering Bug. This is a V1 Buzz Bomb, German cruise missile from World War II. This was much more effective than the Kettering Bug I showed you earlier. This has a pulse jet engine on it, so it was very fast, fairly small. It was difficult to catch, but it could still be shot down and intercepted by fighters. So it could still be stopped. It wasn't that accurate. It couldn't really pick out a target, a building, but they could hit London. And that's all they really cared about. A big enough bomb that if it could land somewhere in London and detonate, it would do a lot of damage, kill a lot of people. So that was basically all the Germans were looking for. The missile behind it, that's a V2. That is a liquid-cooled ballistic missile. There was no defense against the V2. There were no interceptor missiles at that time. The fighters couldn't catch it. There was no way to stop them. High altitude, come back down into high Mach speed. They couldn't stop it. The only way to stop the V2 was to divert the bomber missions to attack the factories and launch sites that they were coming from and destroy them on the ground. Once they destroyed the factories and the launch sites, then the bomber missions could be sent to other factories. But that was the only way we could defend against the V2. Okay, this is a Junkers Ju-88 German bomber, one of the types that was used during the Battle of Britain. And under the wing is a very interesting interceptor. This is a rocket-powered interceptor, a Messerschmitt 163. It was very, very advanced technology. Has a liquid rocket engine here. Very fast, swept wing. Unfortunately, fortunately for us, it only had 7 minutes of fuel. So it was very high technology, but it only had 7 minutes of fuel, which meant it had to be based close to the target that they were defending. They could climb up to altitude above the bomber formations, dive through, try to shoot something down, and then have it glide down to a landing. Because it was gliding to a landing, the wheel would actually drop off on takeoff, and it would land on the skid underneath that. So it was not very effective. It was very high technology, very advanced, but it was not a very effective weapon. This, on the other hand, was a very effective weapon. This is the Messerschmitt 262. This was the first operational jet fighter. This was about 100 miles per hour faster than any fighter we had, faster than the P-51 or any other fighter we had. It was because it also had 4 30-millimeter cannon in the nose, so it had very heavy firepower. Very effective from that standpoint. But once you got into a turning dogfight, it couldn't turn any better, couldn't maneuver any better in a turning maneuvering type of fight than any other fight. So once you got into a turning fight, it lost the advantage of its higher speed. So it could outrun anything, but in a turning fight, it had no advantage. It used two axial flow engines. This is a cutaway version of the axial flow engine. You see it has a compressor stage here that compresses the air, pulls the air in and compresses it to high pressure. That high pressure air goes through the combustion chamber where they add fuel and ignite it. And then that fuel, that burning high pressure air, then drives the turbine. And the turbine is what spins the compressor. So basically, you have to get the engine spinning at a high speed before you add the fuel. Once you get it up to a rate fast enough, spinning fast enough, then you can add the fuel and it'll continue running. To get it up to that speed, you have a small piston up here, starter engine, that can be turned on in the cockpit. It starts spinning it up with just higher speed than the fuel runs. But if it doesn't start with that, you notice that little ring on the front? That's a pull start. Just like you want to pull it, but you get a little motor going, and then you eventually start the engine. Okay. I mentioned briefly mentioned helicopters earlier. We have two helicopters hanging up on the ceiling here. By 1944, helicopters had been developed to the point where they were practical, but the Army really didn't know quite what to do with them. So they sent a couple of them to the China-Burma theater to see what they could use them for. Mostly used them for liaison, for observation, just flying around, seeing what was going on. But they did use them, a few of them, for picking up down air crew in the jungle. So if the airplane crashed in the jungle, they could pick them up with a helicopter. So there were a few instances where they were starting to use helicopters for picking up down air crew. A few years later, during the Korean War, just a couple of years later, helicopters were used much more extensively for picking up down air crew and for evacuating wounded. So by that time, they were used much more effectively. Okay, the last airplane I'm going to show you is the B29. This was the largest bomber that we used in World War II. It was used exclusively in the Pacific against Japan because we needed long-range bomber. This is the actual bomber that dropped the second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. This is the aircraft that dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima was the Enola Gay. That's in the Smithsonian. This is the boxcar, and this dropped the second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. This is what's called a silver plate version of the B-29. Silver plate meant it was modified specifically for the atomic mission. The atomic bombs were very heavy, so they had to lighten the aircraft. To do that, they took off most of the defensive guns. A normal B-29 would have a couple of gun turrets on the top and on the bottom. Those gun turrets were removed from this aircraft. The only guns on this aircraft are the two guns in the tail gun position. So it only has two guns in the tail gun position. They also took off some of the armor plating. By the time this was in service, by the time this was used, America had pretty much air supremacy over Japan. Japanese fighters did not have the altitude capability to get up to the higher altitude that the B-29 was operating at, so they felt they could send this in with very minimal defensive capability. But as I said, this dropped the second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. Now, I ran a little bit over. It's 11:28. If you're interested in the tour of the second building, that starts at 11:30, so you have about 2 minutes. Actually, you should be able to catch them. Just go, if you go out this way, under the glass, go to the left, to the second building, look for a guy with a box around his neck like this, and either he's started, you should be able to join up. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Any last questions? Well, no. Bomber crews specific. So you go.
Yeah. Oh, for the B29 going all the way to Japan.
Yeah. So they were using B-24s before the Japan. So they were a lot of
in the Pacific, the B-24 in the Pacific is mostly used over New Guinea and all that, right?
Yeah. Well,
because it's more famous for the European theater, but I know that
they were using